Hey everyone, thanks for taking the time to check out my video. This is Belmont's Word, a segment where I take a look at and review a game. We're looking at Diablo 4 Season 3 and how exactly I felt about the additions Season 3 brought to the game. Diablo 4 Season 3 brings evil arcane constructs into the mix, alongside quite a few improvements to the game's base content. How does it compare to Season 2? Well, it is certainly a step in the right direction, even if it is a small one. A lot of the improvements are welcome overall, and the seasonal content could hint at a seasonal pattern as to what each season may or may not include in the future. Before getting into it all, I want to talk about the changes they made that felt great. The first one being simple, but they've added an event timer to the map screen. On the top left, you'll be able to see any events such as Legion events or world boss spawns when they are close to happening. Secondly, hell tides have been improved greatly. Hell tides are now almost always up, with only a 5-minute break between each hell tide. Furthermore, the Chest of Mysteries and the Chest of Living Steel now simply show up on the map screen. These changes were major for the game, as it now allows for more consistent farming within the hell tide zones. Also, the seasonal questline is no longer gated behind seasonal journey progress. As per the usual, I went into this season with 5 goals of my own. These generally won't change unless the seasonal content is very specifically changed in a certain way. For this season, my goals remain the same as they were in Season 2. 1. Make a build of my own. 2. Engage with and experience the new system mechanic. 3. Defeat the new Uber boss. 4. Complete the season pass. And 5. Have fun. Let's take a look at what I ran this season. As before, I do not use any guides or meta builds, and I try to come up with something myself. I think this helps demonstrate how accessible the game can be. That is, if I'm able to get a build up and running, to clear a mix of the game's endgame content without having to consult a guide. I prefer to play the game rather than have to watch guides for hours. Druid was always a class I had an interest in back in the Diablo 2 LOD days. I never quite got around to it, but I always thought that the idea of a werebear was really cool. As such, I wanted to finally try that out, in its newer form of course, in Diablo 4. I went with Druid, Werebear, and a small glance at the skill tree and skills pushed me towards trying out Pulverize Overpower. Overall, the build worked out incredibly well. Overpower is an interesting mechanic, and combined with Pulverize, I absolutely felt like an actual bear, running around slamming and 1-2 shotting most enemies in a huge area. I found this build to be very fun, and stacking defensive stats such as health to improve overpower further helped facilitate the feeling of being a beefy bear man. Now let's look at the season itself. The season brought along these construct monsters. I personally did not enjoy this theme, as arcane constructs just don't really do much for me in terms of excitement. The main character changing mechanic this time around came in the form of a pet. The pet has its own equipment screen where you can equip with 2 different abilities and then alter these 2 abilities in 3 different ways using the tuning stones. This mechanic is somewhat similar to how spells and support gems work in Path of Exile. There's a large variety offered here, but the reality is I just didn't find it as enjoyable as the vampire powers. Don't get me wrong, the pet itself is very powerful and seems to be able to assist a wide variety of builds and classes. However, its visual power felt pretty lacking compared to the vampire powers. As mentioned, the pet itself requires governing stones and tuning stones. These are gotten from either construct zones or nightmare vaults. Construct zones are extremely similar to the vampire zones. Basically, around the world map, there are these zones that have constructs in them. Kill them, complete various related objectives, summon the construct boss, and get runes. Nightmare Vaults, on the other hand, were quite a surprise. I'm not sure if the developers intended for them to replace Nightmare Dungeons for a season, but they certainly did for me. These vaults are very similar to Nightmare Dungeons with a slight twist. You spend currency to give yourself a warding buff. The warding buff loses a stack for every trap you hit throughout the vault. At the end of the vault, there are chests, which you can then spend your remaining warding stacks on to open. However, you are also granted the Paragon Glyph experience well at the end. Overall, these vaults felt much more rewarding, and certainly much quicker than doing Nightmare Dungeons. As a result, I only ever ran vaults to level up my Paragon Glyphs. That being said, there's also a new type of hunter that can spawn in these Nightmare Vaults. Alongside the Butcher, a new enemy, the Son of Malphus, can spawn to hunt down the player. However, unlike the Butcher, this fight is unfortunately very tedious. He has a very large health pool, and he doesn't really do anything outside of a leap and a triple slam. The fight always seems to drag on forever, and it felt very uninteractive. I like the idea of this hunter type that spawns in the Nightmare Dungeon, but I do feel like they should have a unique identity and fight to go alongside with their encounter. The final piece of seasonal content is a new Uber fight, Uber Malphus. As a disclaimer, this was my last main venture with the season, and I did end up consulting a druid guide here due to wiping so many times. Thankfully, I didn't have to change my build at all. My wiping, as in fact, was a skill issue. For the fight, from what I can remember, the only change I made to my build based on the guide was swapping the aspect on my necklace to my weapon and vice versa. Now, on paper, I really like this fight. I think it's a cool fight that can teach you time management, dodge management, and spacing practice. The boss is immobile, and he has 4 different, we'll call them stances. 1 for lightning, 1 for cold, 1 for fire, and 1 for poison. You can force his stance to change by destroying the currently active pillar. Allowing the pillar to stay up for too long will result in a highly damaging attack, so you are forced to change his stances. This is where time management comes in handy. Malphus has 1 attack that he does himself, and 1 additional attack that is granted by whatever stance he's in. Of course, his stance's attack corresponds to the stance's element. Lightning causes various bolts to strike the ground, ice closes off a portion of the platform with ice damage, fire causes striking lanes of firewalls, and poison causes a poisonous rotating wave to rotate outward from Malphus. Now, in practice, the fight ends up being quite anti-melee due to a number of these attacks. The first being Malphus's only actual attack, in which he lowers his hand and sends out 3 saw blades. If you are within melee range, these saw blades will all hit you at once and make you experience a huge spike of damage. This is Malphus's only direct attack, so you're going to have to constantly move through him or strategically position yourself around him and be extremely careful not to lock yourself down when he's about to attack. The second major anti-melee mechanic is more manageable. During his poison stance, he will unleash a wave of poison that flows in a circle, growing outward from him. This can result in the same situation as the saw blades. If he switched to the poison stance, and you're on top of him, you will eat the damage from the wave almost instantaneously. As such, you are constantly having to manage your spacing and your timing. In the end, this fight was quite a challenge. Afterwards, I went and fought Uber Duriel with no real issues. So I felt that Uber Malphus was much more difficult than Uber Duriel. I'm quite curious if Uber Malphus will be added to the boss ladder in some way. Finally, onto the Season Pass. There are no changes as far as I could tell in terms of progression. It felt like I progressed the Season Pass a bit slower, but I also got stuck in one of the season chapters as I was unaware of how to proceed with the objective. However, there are still no dailies or weeklies, and all Season Pass experience is gained by completing seasonal objectives or simply killing monsters. As everything is cosmetic, it's entirely up to you if it's worth it or not. Despite not being too interested in the Arcane Construct theme, I still found quite a few items in the Season Pass to be really cool. It's worth noting that the Gauntlet, which is the leaderboard mode, is currently, at the time of me writing this, not available in the game. However, to be completely honest, I really don't have any interest in leaderboards, so it's unlikely that I would engage with that mechanic anyway. For feedback, I'd really like to see more improvements to Helltides. I think Helltides are interesting content that can be improved in various ways. I also feel like the monster density of Helltides just isn't there yet. I'd like to see an increase in density alongside with different bosses, perhaps like the dungeon hunters, like a butcher being able to be summoned and killed for greater rewards. I'd also like to see a kind of reward system implemented for Nightmare Dungeons. I currently feel like leveling Paragon Glyphs is still kind of tedious, and I think that this could be improved with a bonus system of sorts for the Nightmare Dungeons. For example, I've seen people mention that events aren't worth doing in the Nightmare Dungeons. How about having a completion of those events add a percentage increase to the amount of Paragon experience rewarded at the end? The same could be said for the Butcher or any other bonus enemies they include. Killing him could increase the amount of Paragon Glyph EXP at the end. Or how about looking at the number of revives, for example? The number of revives remaining could also be added to increase that Paragon Glyph EXP even more. I think there's a lot of ways that Blizzard could improve Nightmare Dungeons to be more interactable for the player, and have your performance within the dungeon grant you a bonus to the amount of Paragon Glyph experience you get. Overall, the season is fun, but it's not as impactful as Season 2. I think there is a bit of a pattern emerging in the seasons. We're seeing seasonal zones with seasonal enemies, and the seasonal power being specifically tied to killing enemies in those zones. Nightmare Vaults were a nice change of pace, though, and I'm curious to see how Blizzard can differentiate the seasons a little bit more with their mechanics. That's my review of Diablo 4 Season 3. Thanks for taking the time to listen to my feedback for it. Did you enjoy the video? Feel free to leave a like. Do you have any thoughts on Season 3? Leave them below in a comment. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.